Thank you so much for joining us today. Pacific Legal Foundation is proud to put on equity versus equality in American society. I'm going to turn it over now to Senior Attorney Wen Fa.
Thank you, Gwen. This is going to be a very exciting event. I'm pleased to have with us three great panelists for today's panel. I am a senior attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. I have litigated cases in all of PLF's practice areas and focus on equality before the law. In my cases, I represent farmers, small business owners, and other individuals in challenging racially discriminatory farm loan forgiveness programs, COVID relief grants, and COVID treatment allocation. Having immigrated to America from Beijing, I believe that individualism and innovation are critical to human flourishing in the United States and around the world. I relish the opportunity to advance these ideals through my litigation and public outreach. Also joining us today is Onkar Ghate. Onkar is the Chief Philosophy Officer and Senior Fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. He is the Institute's resident expert on objectivism and serves as its senior trainer and editor. He has taught philosophy for over 10 years at ARI's Objectivist Academics Center. Dr. Ghate is also a contributing author to a number of books on Rand's fiction and philosophy. His op-eds have appeared in venues that range across the ideological spectrum, and in addition, he's been interviewed on national and international radio and has appeared as a television guest on several networks. So we're very pleased to have Onkar as well. Finally, last but not least, is my colleague, Glenn Roper. Glenn joined the Pacific Legal Foundation in 2019. Based in Colorado, he litigates across the country on behalf of individuals and organizations to advance the principles of individual freedom, separation of powers, and the rule of law. Immediately prior to joining PLF, Glenn served as Deputy Solicitor General in Colorado's Office of the Attorney General. Prior to that, he was a partner in a Denver law firm and previously served as Deputy Associate Counsel in the White House Counsel's Office for President George W. Bush, and was a law clerk to Judge Ebell of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. So we're very delighted to have three amazing speakers on today's panel. And with that, I will kick it off to Onkar to discuss the philosophy of individualism and how it gave rise to the idea of equity. Onkar, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Wen. Thanks for having me on the panel. To talk of how we went from equality to equity, which is one of today's buzzwords when we're talking about these issues, and I'll say a word about racial equity as well at the end. I think the place to start is with the Declaration of Independence, which is the document that enunciates the American ideal of what the country is striving for, I think, politically, and it's a moral vision of politics. So the original American conception is of a equality of rights. So that's what the Declaration of Independence is talking about, and then governments are instituted to secure and protect these rights. Another way you could put it is that it's about equality of freedom, that's the American ideal. So regardless of your ancestry, if you're an aristocrat, if you supposedly have noble blood or not, if you're rich or poor, if you come to America, you'll be equally free, that each individual should be free, equally free to pursue his or her own happiness. That's the American ideal. It's an individualistic ideal that each individual has the right and the freedom to do this. And thinking of the American experiment, one theme or strand in it across the centuries is a real fight, a political and moral fight to make this individualistic ideal fully real. So obviously the glaring contradiction to the Declaration of Independence, when you think about the founding of the nation, was slavery. So you had to fight for the Declaration. That's what the American Revolution is. But we had a second major war, the Civil War, that's trying to bring equality in the sense of equal rights and equal freedom to a whole class of people who didn't have it. And the same then, if you think of the battle for women's rights, it's that they're to enjoy equal rights, equal freedom to pursue their own happiness. And that goes into the 20th century, both for obviously for women's rights and for battling Jim Crow and segregation and so on. But when you look, so that's sort of, you can think about the trend in the culture in America and some of the political trends. But if you think what's happening intellectually, I think more and more there's a shift from thinking about the ideal as an individualistic ideal of equality of rights to it. First, you get equality of opportunity, and then equality of results or equality of outcomes. And I think that's when we get to that equity is another name for that. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But even it's not really thought of that often this way, but equality of opportunity is not the American ideal. There's a difference between saying equality of opportunity and freedom of opportunity. I think the American ideal is freedom of opportunity, but it's not, we're trying to make everybody's opportunities equal. So, and just take some examples to see what this would mean if you're taking seriously equality of opportunity as an ideal. I, for instance, had great parents. And the result of that is like they spent a lot of time with us, taught us things that you're not learning in school or even before we went to school and so on. That gave me opportunities that someone with bad parents who didn't do this, or not as good parents who didn't do this, have fewer opportunities than I. Or my parents weren't particularly wealthy. So people kids born into a more wealthy family would have opportunities that I didn't have. We still all, if our rights are protected, have freedom of opportunity to make the most of the opportunities we have and to create new opportunities for ourselves. But if your ideal is equality of opportunity, then you would be thinking, well, okay, it's unjust when the opportunities aren't equal and the state or the government has to step in to redress these things. It's an issue of justice and so on. And that is, I mean, if you're telling my parents, well, you can't educate your children because other people aren't doing it, and we have to equalize opportunities and so on, you would start committing all kinds of injustices if you have an individualistic conception of injustice. So that was already a move away from the American ideal. And then it became, well, equality of opportunity isn't enough, because even if you somehow equalize opportunities, people will make different uses of the opportunities that they have. Some people will take real advantage of them, make something of themselves, create new opportunities for themselves. Other people will not be bothered to do that, won't do it, will choose not to do it. And so if you're looking at results, you'll still get unequal results. And if the more you're taking from equality, it's not equality of rights or freedom, but what we really care about is outcomes. Equality of opportunity is not sufficient, so you need equality of results or equality of outcome. And I think of equity as it's just a new name, and it sort of, equality of results is a phrase, it's 3 words. Equity is one word that names this as this is the supposed ideal. And again, if you're thinking at a kind of intellectual, philosophic level, I think where this really comes in as, okay, this is the new ideal that we should adopt and that we have to change society in accordance with this ideal, it comes with the egalitarian philosophy. So I bet many people here have heard of John Rawls. You may not have read his 600, 700-page book, A Theory of Justice, but he's the one who really brings egalitarianism into the mainstream intellectually, philosophically. It was taken as a major work, a whole academic industry sprung up around writing about egalitarianism, developing the ideas and in a theory of justice. And there's 2 major ideas, I think, to focus on to get how we're moving away from the American ideal of equal freedom or equal rights and moving away from individualism, and that we're getting a very different ideal here that people now are rallying around more and more intellectually. And so one is that what the theory of justice tells us is to focus on, when we're thinking about what a just society is, just institutions, a just government, it all has to be geared to the most helpless and hopeless people. In a theory of justice, it's put as the least advantaged members of society. Everything has to be constructed and tailored around them and trying to make their lives better. In today's language, it's you focus on the most marginalized. They're the people who count. Everything has to be designed around the marginalized. And it doesn't matter why they're marginalized. If it's through, like, if there's reasons why they should be, because they're not very good people and so on, you're just focus on the least advantage, to use the terminology in a theory of justice. Today's terminology is the most marginalized. This was, you may have heard of Rawls. This is his second principle of justice, the so-called difference principle. And this is quoting in part from the way it's characterized in the book. It's, quote, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. And this is really means, like, all social and economic institutions have to be reconstructed around this new idea that it has to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. And the second idea that you get in the egalitarian philosophy or morality is that there's really no such thing as an individual who forms his own character, who chooses his path in life, who earns or fails to earn his own happiness. It's a very deterministic world in which all of us are products of our environment plus our genetics. And it's sort of just the luck of the draw in the end, if you succeed or fail. And it's those two ideas, that there's not really individual achievement, individual success and failures and so on. And so there's just sort of your social environment plus your genetics that determine everything, and that you're supposed to reconstruct everything around the most marginalized, to use today's terminology. That became in, I think, academic circles, one of the, if not the dominant moral ideal. And if you see something like racial equity, it's just this framework packaged around race. So who's the least advantaged members of society? It's supposedly marginalized racial groups. And whether it's put today, I mean, it's put in a different way, black and brown people, or people of color, to revive a term from the 20th century. That's who we have to focus on, and society has to be designed around this again. And that's just the egalitarian framework applied to race. And here, for instance, to take a very popular book from Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, this is his definition. It's his definition of racial inequity. And notice it's just about equality of outcome or equality of results. This is the definition, quote, racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. Continuing the quote, here's an example of racial inequity. 71% of white families lived in owner-occupied homes in 2014, compared to 45% of Latinx families and 41% of Black families. Racial equity is when two or more racial groups are standing on relatively equal footing. Close quote. So it's just about equality of outcome, regardless of what the causes are for why there may be differences and so on. That's what we want. And notice the focus just on groups. There's no individuals here. It's just the group. And to get what it really means, that there's no focus on what the causes are. I lived, when I was a kid, I'm from Canada, lived in Canada. In the 80s, we had, Canada was one of the countries that took the Vietnamese fleeing from Vietnam, the so-called Vietnamese boat people. And I mean, they're coming with, obviously, with basically just a shirt on their back. That's it. And if you said, like 5 years later, if you looked at these Vietnamese people and said, look, they have fewer owner-occupied houses than other people, and they probably do white people in it, that's a sign of racial inequity. That's an injustice, a social injustice that has to be rectified, and rectified by the government. And that's such a non-individualist perspective on earning things and on justice. But I think this is, how did we get from equality to equity in this whole focus? I think that's in outline the trajectory, and it's really egalitarianism applied when we're talking about racial equity and inequity. It's egalitarianism applied to issues of race, and particularly thinking of people as grouped into racial categories.
Thank you, Ankar. That's very informative. I think I'll have something similar to discuss, which is defining equity and equality and explaining sort of some of the common confusion and misconception around the two concepts. So I think going off of what Ankar just said, equality and equity, as we use it, are really shorthand for other terms or shorthand for ideas. I have seen in the rare circumstance in which equity is used to connote equal treatment. So I'm not talking about that. I am talking about equity to in uses in which it connotes equality of outcome between groups. So I think there are sort of two differences between equality and equity as we understand them today that Ankar touched upon in his presentation. So the first choice you have is, what are we talking about between equality of outcome, equality of opportunity, and equality of rights? Equality of outcome means that, you know, people have the same results, no matter what their interests, no matter what their ability, no matter what they did to achieve something. You have equality of outcomes for everybody. Equality of opportunity, that's something that's actually been sort of put on a pedestal by people who are sort of anti-equity, but I think for reasons that Ankar mentioned, equality of opportunity is also not the ideal that we're going for, because, you know, when you're talking about people who have a lot, if you're talking about Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, you know, they have more opportunities than someone who might have grown up in poverty. And that's not necessarily, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we want to maximize opportunities for everybody, a result of that is that some people will have more opportunities than other people, but it shouldn't stop us from wanting to increase opportunity for everybody. So what we're talking about with equality before the law is what Ankar said, is equality of rights. And I think that is a system that maximizes opportunity for everybody. That's a system that allows for human flourishing. When you talk about people's property rights, the right to contract, being protected by things like courts, but that limited involvement by the government really allows individuals to flourish, to go after what it is that they want to achieve, to strive towards their conception of the good life. And it's one that increases opportunity for everybody. So I think what we're talking about with equality is equality of rights. What we're talking about with equity is equality of outcome. The other, I would say, choice or here dichotomy between equity and equality, in my view, is this notion that Ankar touched upon that's about individualism versus collectivism. When I think about equality, I think about the individual. I think about individuals that are judged based on their individual characteristics, such as their achievement, their ability, and their aspirations. People want different things, and that's good. And people have different assets and abilities, and that's good too. That I think that is what makes the world great. That is what allows us to trade. That is what allows individuals to flourish in a free society. But when you're talking about equity, a lot of the equity discussion is focused on groups, and not groups that you can choose. Not like, I joined Pacific Legal Foundation. That's a group I can choose. But it's about groups based on immutable characteristics and oftentimes arbitrary government definition of, this individual is Hispanic, This other individual is Asian, which includes, people of dozens of different countries. And we're talking about groups. So Ankar mentioned Kendi's famous book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he says, well, the way to ensure equity is to make sure groups have the same outcomes, they have the same results. But groups themselves are sort of a fiction in a way. It's something that you create. There really isn't any group outside of the individuals that are composed of that group, compose that group, and individuals in that group will have varying aspirations, they'll have varying achievements, they'll have varying abilities. So it's really sort of a mockery on terms to say that groups by themselves can have equal outcomes or should have equal outcomes. I think one last difference between equity and equality, something that I've seen, I think, especially in the past 2 or 3 years, is that when you talk about equity, a lot of people who support equity promote sort of a culture or a system of victimhood. They say these bad things have happened to me, or not even these bad things have happened to me, but these bad things have happened to people who I don't know, but share the same broad racial group. So therefore, I should get benefits because I am also a member of that group. I think that's the wrong approach. I don't deny that, different people have certainly faced different obstacles in the world. But I think the focus shouldn't be on victimhood. It should be on empowerment. How do we eliminate barriers to make sure that each individual, regardless of membership in any given group, has the opportunity to succeed, has the opportunity to start a business, has the opportunity to earn a living, has the opportunity to get an education best suited to his or her interests and abilities. I think that's what we should be focused on. And I think that's why when we talk in today's term, equality is much more preferable than equity. Also wanted to talk about some misconceptions about this whole equality and equity debate. And I think the main misconception comes with equity. A lot of people, when they think about equity, they think about fairness, but that's a total misconception. Equity, as it's properly understood, is deeply unfair, because when you're talking about proportional group representation at a broad group level, you are, by definition, talking about limiting opportunities for the individual. And I don't want to, get too much into what Glenn is going to be talking about in his session, but I just want to provide 2 examples of how exactly that is. Earlier this week, we filed a case challenging Iowa's gender balancing requirement for members that can serve on public boards such as the State Judicial Nominating Commission. So the State Judicial Nominating Commission, they do the important work of interviewing judicial candidates and selecting judges to Iowa's Court of Appeals and to the Supreme Court. Iowa law requires they have 4 congressional districts. There must be 1 man and 1 woman in each of those congressional districts. So basically, our two clients, the plaintiffs in the case we filed earlier this week, are a woman who is prevented from running in her district because her seat is reserved for a man, and a man who is prevented from running in his district because that seat is reserved for a woman. And that's deeply unfair when you think about it. This quota deprives opportunities for nearly half of all Iowans each election cycle because they reserve specific seats for male and female candidates. The seats do not go to the best qualified candidates. And in fact, our female client, Rachel Racklaw, she did the exact same job for 6 years in Iowa, interviewing and nominating judges to Iowa's district court, but she's disqualified, absolutely excluded from consideration, doing the same thing for Iowa's appellate court, for no other reason than because it would upset Iowa's precious gender balance. So I think that highlights how a fixation on group representation stifles individual opportunity. And the second thing I want to mention is our case that we litigated a few years ago on behalf of 7 Black and Hispanic families in the city of Hartford who wanted to get into world-class magnet schools in the city, and they were stuck in the waiting list, on the wait list for those schools. Hartford had a proportional group representation quota in which they reserved 25% of the seats at those magnet schools for white and Asian students. But guess what? A lot of those students attended already good schools in the suburbs of Hartford. They didn't want to commute to the city to attend these magnet schools. So they actually had to, these magnet schools actually had to leave seats empty than to admit our clients from their failing neighborhood schools into these magnet schools where they would have a world-class education. That is a clear example of how this fixation on group representation limits individual opportunities, and it's deeply unjust. So with that, I will turn it to my colleague, Glenn Roper, and he'll explain where the push for equity is evident in society today, and he'll touch on Pacific Legal Foundation's cases that focus on equality before the law. Glenn?
Well, thank you, Wen, and thank you, Dr. Gate, for your comments. Also, appreciate our audience taking the time to be with us today. Even though the term equity, as used in this context, has been around for decades, I think it really gained special momentum in 2020, with both the killing of George Floyd and its aftermath, and then with the election of President Biden. So a popular explanation of equity can be found in a video that Vice President Kamala Harris issued shortly before the election. And in that video, she said, quote, "There's a big difference between equality and equity. Equality suggests everyone should get the same amount, but equitable treatment means we all end up in the same place." So setting aside her problematic description of equality, which focuses on who gets what, I think how she describes equity really encapsulates the underlying assumption that any sort of differences in representation or income or wealth or these other categories we've talked about across groups, and especially racial groups, must be due to either direct or systemic discrimination, rather than individual choices or culture or the other factors that Dr. Ghazi talked about. And then the next step for proponents of equity is that government and other institutions need to step in to resolve those statistical disparities or fix those statistical disparities. And we're seeing that push at every level of government, as well as in many public and private institutions. Let me mention just a couple of areas in particular where it's taken hold. First, equity has been a major focus of the federal government during the Biden administration. On his first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order entitled Advancing Racial Equity, and he established what he called a whole of government, an ambitious whole of government equity agenda. So that focus on equity has really permeated the executive branch. In fact, earlier this week, the White House issued a 300-page report on the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. So you'll remember that was the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package enacted early last year. So this report was entitled Advancing Equity Through the American Rescue Plan. And it focuses throughout the 300 pages on ways in which the COVID relief bill advanced equity, helped certain racial groups, and other ways that have been talked about. And it describes that legislation as, quote, being on track to deliver the most equitable recovery of any federal stimulus package in US history. A second area where we've seen a strong equity focus is in educational institutions. So last year, a study of public colleges and universities found that the average university has 45 administrators, more than the size of their history department, who are focused on promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, including through rewriting policies and revising admissions criteria. This time of year, it's graduation season. And this year, we're seeing dozens of universities who are holding special segregated graduation ceremonies for racial or other minorities, all in the name of equity. And then, of course, this fall, the Supreme Court is going to be hearing a challenge to Harvard University's admissions policy, which is claimed to be designed to limit the percentage of Asian Americans who are admitted to the school. So at PLF, we're concerned with this push for equity because it quickly starts to infringe on the principle of equality before the law, or equality of rights, that both Wen and Onkar have talked about. Too often, we see when the government starts to get involved to try to advance equity or fix some of these statistical disparities, they do so in a way that violates the equal protection that's guaranteed by the Constitution. And let me just highlight 3 groups of PLF cases that I think are relevant with a couple of examples. And Wen gave some of those already, but I'll list a couple more. First are cases where the government seeks to directly provide benefits on the basis of characteristics such as race or gender in order to remedy a perceived disparity. So one of the best recent examples is a challenge we brought on behalf of farmers across the country to a provision of the American Rescue Plan that I was just talking about, a provision of that plan that provided debt relief to farmers and ranchers who are, quote, socially disadvantaged. And the way that the statute defined socially disadvantaged was just about race. That was the only criterion. And under the statute, every farmer or rancher of every race and ethnicity, except for non-Hispanic white farmers, had their federal loans forgiven. That was what the statute provided. Well, we considered that a pretty clear violation of equal protection. We sued on behalf of various white farmers, and we got a nationwide preliminary injunction against that policy. The government tried to justify that policy in the litigation by pointing to statistical disparities in how racial groups of farmers have fared across the country, essentially saying that singling out white farmers is justified because of equity. A second group of cases are those where the government directly institutes quotas that are either race or sex-based. In California, for instance, we're challenging a law that requires corporate boards for every corporation that is based in California to have a minimum number of women or racial minorities. So we've sued on behalf of shareholders who would like the freedom to vote for whoever they think would be the best person to be on the board, rather than having to make sure that they elect a certain number of racial minorities or women to go along with it. Wen also talked about the Iowa challenge, which, as he indicated, it requires that if there's a woman who wants to join the Judicial Nominating Commission and there's a vacancy, but it's a vacancy that was held by a man, a man seat, so to speak, she's excluded from consideration. So those are the quota cases. Finally, a third group of cases are our education cases. And here we've brought challenges on behalf of parents or prospective students who would like to gain entrance to competitive high school or other schools. And Wen talked about the Hartford case. That's a great example of one of the cases we've brought. In each of these cases, the admissions policy is changed or altered or enacted in order to promote equity. And often what we'll see is that the purpose is to limit the number of Asian Americans who are admitted to these competitive schools. We've brought various challenges in different cities. Let me just highlight Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. That's a school in Virginia. It's widely regarded as one of the best, if not the best, public high school in the nation. In 2020, again, following the killing of George Floyd and that aftermath, the school board voted to overhaul the admissions process to limit the number of Asian Americans who were being accepted to the school and to increase the number of Black and Hispanic students who were admitted. To get to that point, they eliminated the competitive exam that had been the basis for admissions in the past. And instead, they designed a policy that would restrict the number of students attending each middle school who could be accepted to TJ, and that would prioritize middle schools that in the past had not sent many students to TJ. Facts that we developed in discovery, I guess let me say that as the school board intended and expected, this change in policy led to a 20% drop in Asian American representation. And that was because the Asian students tended to be clustered at certain middle schools, and the new policy restricted how many of them could be accepted to TJ. Facts that we developed in discovery showed that the policy change was driven by concern for equity. Slides that were shown to the school board in giving these new proposals for change policies had in big bold letters across the top, leading with equity. And comments by board members showed that their concern was with having the racial balance of TJ match that of the surrounding community in Northern Virginia. And internal school board messages also talked about needing to, quote, move towards greater equity to be clearly distinguished from equality. So even the school board recognized that they were doing something different from equality in pursuing equity here. In that case, the trial court agreed with us and granted summary judgment to our clients, concluding that the school board had violated equal protection. The school board is continuing to fight, and we're defending that decision on appeal. So I know I went through those cases kind of quickly. You can find more information about all our cases on this area on the website. Let me just conclude my initial comments by saying that I think economist F.A. Hayek had it right when he wrote, "There is all the difference in the world between treating people equally and attempting to make them equal. While the first is the condition of a free society, the second means a new form of servitude." So the push for equity that we're seeing in recent years tries to make groups statistically equal at the expense of treating individuals equally and equality of rights. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Glenn. So as a reminder, you can ask questions using the Q&A feature, and I will turn to those briefly. First, I wanted to ask some questions I had for the panelists. On cars, so, I take it from your presentation, you're opposed to racial preferences. I wonder though, are there any ways you think by which the government could increase opportunities for individuals, regardless of race?
Yes. So there's many ways that government could increase opportunities. And I think the basic issue is it needs to get out of the way. That government is involved in all kinds of issues, from education to drug development to banking regulations, and indeed the whole financial system is so heavily controlled by the government. And there's all kinds of ways in which these controls interfere with people's rights and therefore interfere with their ability to pursue their own happiness, to develop opportunities, and then to exploit those opportunities. And whether you go from simple controls like you need licenses to become a hairdresser or something like that, that you're destroying someone's freedom of opportunity. They might have the skills and ability to do it. They don't have the time and money to go through getting the official license to do this. And you've denied them an opportunity that they otherwise would have had if the government were not doing this. And you can multiply that kind of example 100-fold. So yes, there's all kinds of ways in which government is interfering with people's freedom of opportunity.
Wen, could I give an example of that?
Absolutely.
If you don't mind, another of our PLF cases, we have a client, Ursula Newell Davis. She's a social worker in Louisiana, Black woman, great in the community there. She decided she wanted to start a business where she would provide relief for families with special needs children, give those families a break, work with the children, help them develop ways to deal with some of their disabilities and some of thetheir special needs. Well, she submitted her business proposal to the state, and the state denied her ability to start a business. They said, you haven't proven that there's a need for another provider of these services. And here was their real justification. They said it's easier for our regulators to do their job if there aren't as many providers. So, we're gonna forbid you from even showing that you're qualified, from even giving your business a try, just because we want to make the work easier for our providers, and thereby keeping in place all those existing providers, regardless of how good a job they're doing, and not allowing this new entrepreneur to go and start her business and provide services for families in New Orleans.
Definitely. Glenn, if I could ask a follow-up question, on that. So you've litigated a lot of these cases, both in the opportunity space with Ursula and also in the equality space, representing farmers and small business owners and things like that. What does the Constitution say about equality versus equity? What does the Constitution say about opportunity? What are sort of the constitutional arguments we're pressing in these cases?
Yeah, for the most part, our arguments are based in the 14th Amendment, which has what's called the Equal Protection Clause, which requires that states cannot deny people equal protection of the laws. And the Supreme Court has interpreted the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause as providing similar restrictions to the federal government. So, the term equity, as far as I know, although it may, equity has an ancient term in English common law that may show up somewhere in the Constitution, but not in the context we're talking about. It talks about equal protection of the laws. And so the arguments that we're making are generally based on the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause, the equal protection component there, saying that government cannot treat people differently unless it can pass strict scrutiny. And that's a term probably many of our audience are familiar with. It requires the government to have a compelling interest, a very important reason why it wants to treat people differently on the basis of race or some of these other categories. And then it has to show that the way it's trying to do that is narrowly tailored, that it's the least intrusive means to advancing that interest. Very, very difficult hurdle for them to overcome. And so when we can get the court to be addressing these under strict scrutiny, then that gives us some strong ammunition to push back against some of these government plans.
Ankar, I wanted to ask a follow-up to something that you said about group differences in your presentation. So are group differences, in your view, are group differences completely irrelevant, or can they be useful in some circumstances?
I think in a governmental context, they're irrelevant, that the government can't make decisions based on statistics about groups or anything like that. It should be focused on the individual as an individual, treat that individual as possessing rights, and that limits what government can and should be doing. So I think, so in the governmental context, no. In a other context, maybe. So like, say you ran a school and you noticed that we're admitting very few Blacks, and you think it's not because our teachers or the people reviewing applications or anything like that are racist, but it might be that for various reasons, the way we've set it up and so on, we're not really, even though we're not advertising enough in places where there would be Black students applying and so on. And you might think that like this is telling us something, that we've got this disparity, and you're looking at a group level. You're not and thinking, okay, yeah, then maybe there's something, the way either that we screen applications or where we advertise and so on. And if we really want the best students, and we don't think skin color makes any difference to if you're a good student or not, then we have to be concerned that maybe we're not like surveying the whole range and getting the best students. And that's looking at it at a group level. And I could imagine a business or a school doing that, but that's and then implementing processes that it thinks are better. It's still a very individualistic focus. We want the best individual students in the example I'm giving. And we think that maybe we've got some process that is interfering with us getting the best student. And in thinking about that, you might look at groups. It's an individualistic focus. It's looking at groups as a means. I think that's legitimate for businesses and so on to do. For the government, I don't think it should be weighing in on looking at groups and so on. As long as it's focused on the individual and his rights, everything will follow properly from that when we're talking about the law.
Let me ask sort of a similar follow-up to that. And this, doesn't involve, maybe doesn't involve the distribution of benefits and burdens on the basis of race, but what I've seen a lot is, you have all of these months celebrating members of this group or that group. You know, one month might be, you know, Asian American Pacific Islander group. Another month might be a group, celebration of a different group. How do you feel about those things?
Overall, I'm very against them. So there may be an issue of when we've been teaching American history, and I think this is true of the teaching of American history, that we have not taught it properly. That is, we have not had a sufficient focus, say, on the issue of slavery and the fight against slavery and everyone who was involved in that fight against slavery. And you might think then, so there's all kinds of cases of Black individuals who've been omitted from history, who should not have, who played a major role in American history. And if when you're teaching the story of America, you should be teaching these stories. So I can have some sympathy, like if that's the goal, but I don't think the way to achieve it then is to, okay, this month is Black History Month and next month it's Asian American or something like that. It's rather what we want to tell is a truthful, accurate story of American history. And this is part of it. And it's part of it every month. It's not one month that we tell these and the 11 other months we don't have to. It's part of the story. So sometimes I think these can be motivated by something legitimate, but I don't think this is the legitimate means of achieving that, even when it's a legitimate motivation of what you're trying to do.
So thank you for that. Let me turn it to Q&A. So Glenn, I wanted to ask you, one of the audience members asked, how can we combat this at work? And that person, I presume that person works for the National Association of Realtors. But regardless of where one works, you know, how could just people who are not attorneys, how can they combat sort of this sort of newfound enthusiasm for equity in their everyday lives?
Sorry, I was muted. That's a good question. It's a little bit of a tricky question that I think the answer may vary depending on your situation. You know, a lot of these are cultural movements. I think there's some value in standing up for some of the principles that Ankar has talked about, individualism and achievement, and recognizing that people, you know, going back to Martin Luther King, people should be judged not on the color of their skin, on the content of their character, on the decisions that they make, on how they choose to treat other people, and promoting those principles. I think it is important to have people speaking out and speaking up, because otherwise this push for equity can really quickly, you know, catch fire and catch momentum and just sweep through an organization or a business without really giving thought to the alternative perspective. I think, you know, selfishly, I would say supporting the Pacific Legal Foundation. I think that helps us in the work we're doing combating government discrimination and government, you know, emphasis on equity. But I do think in every institution, it's important to have people willing to take a stand and speak up in you know, charitable and collaborative ways, but to explain that we think it's important to focus on individualism and achievement at the expense of focusing on things like skin color.
Yeah, I certainly think it's very important to speak up for principles, for the idea of equal treatment before the law. I think over the last few years, unfortunately, what we've seen in some places is just this sort of movement against freedom of thought. There are certain things, even advocating for the principle of equality before the law has become taboo in some circles. So Ankar, I was wondering if you've seen any sort of the relationship between, I guess, equality before the law and freedom of thought, whether that be at schools or in the workplace or elsewhere.
Yes, I've seen what you were bringing up, when that it's at the level that if you talk about some of these issues and what were the older American ideals, like equality before the law, or Glenn, you were bringing up Martin Luther King. If you bring up that one should be colorblind, there's there's a segment of the people pushing equity who really will say, like, that's discrimination, that itself is racism. So, and really try to shut you up and shut you down. I think that's all the more reason one has to speak up. So I agree with what Glenn said, that one has to speak up. And the more scared you are, I think the more that indicates the need, that someone needs to do it. And for all these kinds of things, it just becomes harder and harder. If no one speaks up now, is it going to be easier 2 years from now to speak up, or is it going to be harder? It's going to be harder and harder. And I think of some of these people as what they're pushing. They have, if you've read, I'm blanking out on the title of the book, but okay, it'll come to me in a moment. That there's a religious mentality here, that they're pushing a dogma, and you either have to accept the dogma, or you're you're a blasphemer who has to be completely ostracized and silenced. There is that more and more that kind of atmosphere. But for me, that's it. You have to speak up now, because it's just going to be harder and harder to do. And I think in terms of speaking, I would just say one last thing. It's important to articulate a positive. Don't just criticize what they're doing. It's no, what we should be doing is what we like. You can use Martin Luther King, as Glenn did, that we should be focused on the content of people's character, not on their skin color or whatever other accidental physiological group you think they belong to, about where they were born or something. But articulate the positive, and you'll get people who rally around you and who are glad you spoke up.
Definitely. And, Glenn is doing a lot of our cases in challenges to discriminatory programs in K through 12 education. And what I found very noteworthy about a lot of those programs that we're challenging is that they're not increasing opportunities for individuals. They're leveling down the playing field. They're getting rid of tests. They're not saying, let's have everybody perform better. They're saying, because this has produced a result that is not the same among groups, we have to get rid of these tests altogether. And I think that's completely counterproductive. Glenn, I was wondering if you have anything to add, either about the cases involving New York specialized schools or Thomas Jefferson in Virginia.
Yeah, no, I think you made the point well. And I just saw this week that there are schools in New York who they've dropped the passing rate from 65% down to 50%. To increase the number of students who are passing. So, this leveling down and trying to make it easier, rather than trying to build people up and help them get the resources and support that they need to rise to the occasion. I think the parents that we represent in the TJ case, they very much want the elementary schools to have the resources they need for students across the spectrum of socioeconomic spectrum and wherever they come from, to get the support and help and to be able to be prepared to excel in a school like TJ, which has a very rigorous curriculum, and which, because of its emphasis on excellence, has helped produce people who are contributing greatly to American society. So I think lowering the expectations is not the way to help. We got to start more from the ground up and providing opportunity and identifying students who have high potential at an early age, and then providing them the resources to get ready to excel in a school like TJ.
And Glenn, let me shift a little bit from the K through 12 cases to the cases involving farm loans and small business grants that you've also litigated in the past year at Pacific Legal Foundation. And this question comes from Ethan Yang, who will be joining us as a law clerk in our DC office. So he was asked, his question was, whether this concept of racial equity is ambiguous enough to where it can be conveniently stretched to justify a wide variety of political objectives. To what extent do you see that as the case? And if so, how can we productively approach racial equity?
You know, a lot of what we're seeing does have that feel to it, that, you know, here is a disparity, a statistical disparity, therefore we can do whatever we want. You know, and the farm loans, I think, is a good example. It's so random to say, we're going to pick everybody who happens to have a farm loan as of this date and forgive them, you know, with this broad brush, you know, program just based on their race. You know, we're not looking at any individual circumstances. We're just looking at it, finding a way to you know, hand this out. And I think there's probably a political favor aspect to some of these, where you have politicians who are looking for ways where they can go to some of their constituents and say, you know, I voted for this benefit for you. But I do think, you know, that is one of the problems with equity. It doesn't have a fixed definition. It doesn't have a clear background in case law like equality does, that can be drawn from. So it does have this malleable aspect to it, where I think particularly politicians use it as a convenient opportunity to try to promote something that, or hand out political favors.
Ankar, I wanted to ask you another question in our Q&A that asks, any idea of the level of public support for the idea of equity? And just to go beyond the question a little bit, it seems like this idea of equity has gotten more and more popular over the past few years. Now, whether that's you know, sort of based off of a confusion or misunderstanding of the concept of individual rights, not, you know, unfamiliarity with the individualism versus collectivism. Why do you think, I mean, am I right that equity has gotten more popular in the past few years? And if so, why might that be?
Yeah, I think that touches, I mean, my answer to that question touches back to the presentation that I gave, that I think it has increased this focus on it. And if you think of equity as it's a quality of outcome or results, that when you look at what has been being taught in universities in the last 50 years, it's increasingly, this is what is taught about what justice consists in. So I talked a little bit about John Rawls. His book was A Theory of Justice, and it's a new conception of justice. And this is what we see, and that now what it will always be put as social justice. This is really coming from that egalitarian perspective. And so I think when one's thinking longer term, what is required to oppose this? What's required is to oppose the egalitarianism that has had growing influence in the universities for 50 plus years. And to oppose it, I think you have to oppose the two, I mean, you have to do more than this, but you have to at least oppose the two ideas that I singled out, that what society is about, if you're concerned with justice, is constructing everything around the least advantaged or the marginalized, as I said, that's the way it's put now, versus what it's about is creating freedom so everyone has the freedom to pursue their own happiness. Those are just radically different ideas, and you have to fight against one, but in favor of the other, that it's about the freedom to the pursuit of happiness. And then the deeper philosophical issue is to oppose the determinism. The more that people accept, and again, I think this in the last 50 plus years has been on ascending, that we're really just a product of our environment and genetics and some combination of those two, versus, no, you have the power of choice. You have the power, to go back to the Martin Luther King, of shaping and forming your own character. And that you do as an individual. You're responsible for that, and therefore you're responsible for the outcomes of that, good or bad. If you don't have that idea, you don't really have the idea of an individual. And so all this focus on groups and so on makes sense, because there is no such thing really as the individual. So I would say those are the two ideas above all else to fight against, but for, like, you need a positive alternative to those ideas.
Well, with that, we are just about out of time. I'd like to thank the panelists for participating in this great event. I want to thank the audience members, those who watched and those who asked questions. We are continuing our webinar series. Our next webinar will likely be in July, and we are already working with some fantastic speakers for those as well. So please keep your eye out for that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.